We are talking today with Steve Taylor. He's a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. Is that correct?
That's correct,
Correct. Yeah. Steve is an author of several best-selling books on psychology and spirituality. And you can find all info on Steve on his website, stephenmtaylor.com. The people of Ponto3.org read Spiritual Science, Stephen's last book. And to put it mildly, we were really, really very much impressed. So I decided to contact Steve and ask him if he would talk to us, and he graciously accepted. So here we are. Steve, thank you for your willingness to talk to us. Appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me.
Because I know your time is, you don't have that much time. So you've been featured in Watkins' Mind, Body and Spirit magazine's list of the 100 most spiritual, influential living people. That's number, I think, 2020, number 62.
I don't know.
It seems as if I just checked it. So,
oh, yeah, okay.
But I did hear
every year the number changes, so I'm not really sure.
I know.
Sometimes it goes up.
Actually,
I think it went down last year, so maybe I did something wrong last year because I went down.
2020, yes, you're 62. You used to be 38, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, really? Wow.
I remember your comment on, what was it, with Eckhart Tolle.
Oh, yeah.
We talked about pots and the pans at home. So, but why do you think this is?
That I'm on the list?
Yes.
Good question. I think it's because one of the things I am trying to do is to integrate spirituality into psychology. So I work a lot within the mainstream. Like I do research, which is published in academic journals. I publish a lot of articles in the mainstream media where I touch on spiritual ideas. I have a column in Scientific American, a blog in Scientific American. So I think because I'm working in the mainstream, partly in the mainstream, I think my work is reaching quite a lot of people, especially my blogs. I have a blog on Psychology Today magazine, which is read by about 100,000 people every month. And again, I think people in general are, especially since at the moment the world situation is quite bleak, and it has been for a while. I think people are realizing that the standard materialist view of reality is not working. I think underlying all of these problems in the world is the standard materialist view of reality. So I think people are looking for, different approaches, different perspectives, and that applies to a lot of people who would not call themselves spiritual. They're still, they would class themselves as rational, scientific people, but they're still looking for alternative approaches. So I think my work is, pointing in that direction.
Right. Eckhart Tolle described your work as an important contribution to the shift in consciousness, which is happening on our planet at present. That was 2013, if I'm not mistaken.
Possibly.
Is it happening? I mean, what do we have to show for it?
Good question. Well, I think in my research as a psychologist, I research transformational experiences, particularly transformational experiences which occur in the context of intense psychological turmoil and suffering. For example, I've just done a research study on bereavement and how a lot of people, or some people, when they undergo a bereavement, they shift into a different perspective. They shift into a different sense of identity. And often that is equivalent to spiritual awakening. And that seems to me to be a fairly common phenomenon, not specifically bereavement, but across the whole range of different types of psychological turmoil. A lot of people are shifting into a different state of being. And it's, basically it's spiritual awakening. From a psychological perspective, maybe you'd call it post-traumatic growth. I sometimes call it post-traumatic transformation. But essentially, it's a shift into a different, a more intense, a more expansive view of reality, a more intense, a more expansive awareness. And that to me is part of evolution. It's the evolution of consciousness. You know, since the beginning of evolution, on the one hand, there has been increasing physical complexity and increasing diversity in life forms. That's the physical, external side of evolution. But there's also the internal, subjective aspect of evolution, which is an increase in consciousness. As living beings become more conscious, become more complex, they also become more conscious, more aware of their surroundings, they have more of an inner life. They're more connected to one another through their compassion and empathy. So, you know, I see spiritual experiences and spiritual transformations as part of this process. It's part of the process of, you know, intensifying consciousness. And I think that is happening now.
Awakening, enlightenment, are those terms sort of, is the same? Because you talk a lot about awakening in your book, isn't it?
Mm.
Now
That's
you're saying,
true.
you know, trauma, and then usually awakening is sort of related, happens after that. Is that correct?
That's true. I don't often use the term enlightenment. But, you know, I'm not too fond of the term enlightenment because it suggests that it suggests a very high, a very rarefied state of being, which is practically unattainable. And also it's a mistranslation of the original Buddhist term, bodhi, which is closer to wakefulness or awakening. So awakening is closer to the original terminology of Buddhism. And also awakening, you know, it's not always an easy or blissful process. Sometimes it is a difficult process. A lot of people who have a sudden spiritual awakening, they struggle to, you know, even though they feel fantastic, they feel connected to other people, they have this intense awareness of their surroundings, the world seems to be a beautiful place to them. But, you know, after a while, they may feel a sense of confusion because they don't really understand what's happened to them because they don't have a context to make sense of it.
Right.
So yeah, sometimes you know, the term enlightenment to me implies something very easy and blissful, but awakening, you know, it can be a difficult process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of it in your book, obviously. Coming to your book, Spiritual Signs, you clearly have a passion for the subject. I mean, that's it's very obvious. Where is this passion coming from? Why did you decide to write this book, this particular book?
It wasn't really a conscious decision. I think a lot of authors would probably say the same, that books grow organically, you know, unconsciously inside you, inside me anyway. So I think for me, it came from an interest in science. I've always been interested in science. I love quantum physics, or physics in general. I love biology, I love astronomy, I have a telescope, I look at the stars, and I'm, you know, amazed at the wonders of the universe and the wonders of the human body. So I love science because it investigates the wonders of the universe and the wonders of nature and the human body. But I also I have always felt that science is associated with a certain view of reality. Science is associated with materialism, you know, the belief that matter is the only thing which exists. Everything can be explained in terms of matter. You know, even consciousness and the mind can be explained in terms of material particles. You know, they can be explained in terms of neurological activity. And the standard scientific view is that, you know, there are no different realms of reality. There is no life after death. There are no, you know, supernatural phenomena like telepathy or near-death experiences are an illusion caused by brain activity and so on. So even though I've always loved science, I never liked the worldview which is associated with science, which is called, you know, you could call it scientism. It's almost like a kind of religious belief system, which is often derived from science, you know, even though really it has nothing to do with science. It's just a paradigm which has evolved from science.
Sure. Well, NDEs and post-materialism, consciousness are things we work with. You know, what we do on the website, what we talking about. It's a focus of the website and of what we do. But more and more scientists seem to subscribe to these kinds of concepts. And the arguments in your last book, are we naive in thinking that more and more scientists get into the fold?
I don't think so. I believe a lot of scientists outwardly conform to the materialist paradigm. You know, if you ask them, they would deny that they believe in psi phenomena or near-death experiences. But I think privately, a lot of scientists are more open to these phenomena. There's a lot of pressure, you know, in academia, in the intelligentsia. There's a lot of pressure to conform to the paradigm. And scientists, you know, like everybody else, they're concerned for their careers. You know, they don't want to cause trouble. They don't want to lose research funding. So, you know, outwardly, they are often dismissive of these phenomena. To give you an example, I met a retired psychologist recently. He's quite a well-known psychologist. I won't tell you his name. But he told me, I met him at a transpersonal psychology conference. And I was surprised because I didn't know he was interested in transpersonal psychology. And he said, well, no, I've always been interested in these phenomena, but I've never talked about them. When I was a prominent psychologist at my university, I always knew that if I talked about these things, it would damage my career. So I never really disclosed my interest. But now I'm retired, I can do what I want. So he was going to, you know, he was talking about transpersonal psychology. He was interested in psi phenomena. And it's a shame that he didn't do that while he was actually a psychologist, you know, at his university. But, you know, he's only human. People have to be realistic and practical. But in any case, I think more and more scientists are opening to a different perspective.
Sure.
I think people are realizing that materialism is not working and it does not really explain the world.
Makes me think of Daniel Dennett. He's working at the same university as my daughter.
Oh, really?
He's also on pension, yes. I don't think he would admit to leaning towards these kinds of concepts. But in other words,
No.
do you think that we are closing the gap between science and spirituality? Is that happening?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, to give you one example, evolution, you know, 20 years ago, the neo-Darwinist paradigm of evolution was very powerful. It was, you know, the accepted view of evolution. But over the last 20 years, it's become more evident that it doesn't actually work. There are lots of problematic aspects of neo-Darwinism. One aspect is that in a lot of cases, mutations seem to happen almost creatively or purposefully in reaction to certain environmental conditions. Almost as if, you know, they occur when they are needed. And they occur at a rate which is way too fast to be explained in random terms. So a lot of scientists now, a lot of biologists are questioning the neo-Darwinist paradigm. They're looking for a kind of more expansive, more integrated view of evolution. And maybe they wouldn't speak in spiritual terms, but there is a kind of unknown aspect. You know, I think there's a realization that a lot of phenomena just can't be explained in materialist terms. So even if scientists are not directly looking for spiritual explanations, you know, that they're appealing to some sort of unknown forces, or they are admitting that things cannot be explained. I mean, consciousness is another example. It's become very common now for scientists to doubt, you know, the naive view that consciousness is caused by brain activity, that consciousness is produced by the brain. There are so many problems with that simplistic view, and you know, and a lot of scientists are now questioning it.
Sure. It's all very well explained in your book, of course. Again, focus is, what we do is NDEs and consciousness and so on. And chapter 6 of your book deals with NDEs, specifically with NDEs. Are you convinced that NDEs are sort of a proof of an afterlife, proof that consciousness is not a product of the brain, but vice versa?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that NDEs prove or at least offer very strong evidence that consciousness is not directly produced by the brain. I mean, obviously, there's no way that consciousness could continue without brain activity if consciousness was purely a product of the brain. And the question Oh, but yeah, one more thing. I always think it's interesting that in NDEs, people often have a sense of oneness. They feel that there's some sort of fundamental spiritual force or energy which seems to pervade the universe, and it brings everything into oneness. And that is exactly the same insights which a lot of mystics have had. It's essentially a mystical experience where everything is the manifestation of some more fundamental spiritual force, and everything is one. And that to me suggests that the fundamental reality of the universe is consciousness, some form of fundamental consciousness. But the question of the afterlife is a little bit more, a little bit more difficult, because, I mean, obviously NDEs show that consciousness continues when the brain is inactive or when the brain is dead, but we don't know how long it can continue for. You could think that consciousness is a kind of echo which continues when the brain is dead. Well, you can imagine that maybe it will slowly fade away when the brain is inactive. But on the other hand, in NDEs, people often meet deceased relatives. They sometimes meet people who they didn't even know were dead, relatives they'd maybe lost contact with and who had maybe died recently. So obviously that suggests some form of afterlife where people retain their identity.
Sure. I've interviewed about 9 of them at present. What strikes me is the after effects of the NDE, the way their life changes, and you see the same thing happening with all of them, the same kind of things happening. So I'm convinced, from what I've heard, I've had an opportunity to look these people in the eyes, And, it's not.
Did they meet deceased relatives? The people you interviewed?
Some of them did, yes. Yes. And what also strikes me is that people are, for example, blind. Report a kind of seeing, isn't it, when they had the NDE? Then the NDE is from children, which is also very.
One materialist theory is that NDEs are a kind of an illusion based on expectations, but children obviously don't have young children don't have those kind of cultural expectations. They don't know what an NDE is. They've not heard about it, so they couldn't create it for themselves.
Correct. But related to the previous question, then, will we ever be able to prove that consciousness is not a product of the brain, but that it is the other way around?
Well, I think it's been proven already. I think there's such strong evidence that, the evidence adds up to an indisputable conclusion. The evidence from mystical experiences, the evidence from psi phenomena, the evidence from near-death experiences, the evidence from studies of the brain, which show that, the brain is not consciousness is not directly associated with the brain. I think the evidence is already there, for people who are open-minded. It's an indisputable conclusion.
Well, it strikes me that the biggest skeptics are usually the ones who claim that they've never read anything about it.
Yeah, and often, not often, they are always very dogmatic people with a very fixed and rigid view of reality. Just like religious people, you can have a conversation with a fundamentalist Christian. You can appeal to their rationality, you can appeal to evidence, but you'll never get anywhere because their beliefs are just too rigid and too fixed. Now, it's the same with a lot of, fundamentalist scientists. You can never get anywhere. It doesn't matter what evidence you show them.
Yeah.
Often they're not prepared to look at the evidence,
Yeah. Also something which is remarkable is that the scientists, and I've met a couple of them, really materialistic thinking scientists, very often are very religious people, and religiously go to church every Sunday. It's
oh yeah.
Yeah. So there's an interesting sentence in your book, Steve. Well, at least to me it is. It's where you write that for you, the issue is not whether there is an afterlife or not, and I'm reading here, but how long individual identity continues after death. Do you think that there is a possibility that we sort of merge with spirit, that we lose our individual kind of identity? Because that's a question I often get from people.
I think it's possible that we retain our individual identity for a certain period of time, but then, well, time is obviously a a concept for this world. Who knows what time means in an afterlife? But for a certain duration anyway. And I think it's possible that slowly individual identity fades away and we merge into a fundamental consciousness. And, it relates to what I said before, that, in near-death experiences, there's no doubt that identity continues for a certain amount of time without the brain activity, but we don't know how long it continues for. But I think my perspective is based on the transmission theory of consciousness, which I talk about in the book.
Yeah.
So this was originally put forward by William James over 100 years ago, but I think it's a very good way of explaining the relationship between the brain and consciousness. The brain, one of the brain's functions is to act as a receiver and a transmitter of consciousness. So consciousness is a
filter,
sorry?
a kind of a filter?
A kind of a filter, only, but not really in the sense, I don't think the brain screens out consciousness, it screens out fundamental consciousness. I think it channels fundamental consciousness into our individual beings. So just like a radio picks up signals, picks up waves, and transmits it into, a radio set. So in the same way, I think the consciousness is everywhere around us. Fundamental consciousness is in the atmosphere. It's in every object, but it's also in space. It pervades space. So our brain picks up this fundamental consciousness and it transmits it into our individual being. So we become individually conscious. And that's why, in mystical experiences or near-death experiences, people feel a sense of oneness because their own consciousness is part of this fundamental consciousness. It's just that in near-death experiences or mystical experiences, individual being merges into this wider being, this wider ocean of consciousness.
So in other words, people with, for example, dementia, it's a dementia in English, obviously. The radio is broken. Can I put it that way?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, materialists often say that, we know that consciousness is produced by the brain because when the brain is damaged, consciousness is also impaired. Or if you take drugs, consciousness is altered. But that's still the case if you use the transmission theory, that obviously if the radio set is damaged, then consciousness will also be damaged.
Right. Somebody mailed me and saying that the book, he says the book is an intellectual exercise. And he says it's an interesting one though, but one, not one written from experience, he says. You didn't have an NDE, Steve?
I haven't had an NDE, no.
Even use the words not, and there's the word again, not enlightened. How would you respond to that?
Well, I haven't had an NDE, but I've had a lot of awakening experiences, spiritual experiences. So my perspective is informed by my own awareness, my own experiences of the oneness of the universe. I've had a lot of experiences where I guess you could call them mystical experiences based in nature, when every individual object or phenomena seems to be interconnected, and they also seem to be the manifestation of something more fundamental. Just like as if they are waves on an ocean. Every object or phenomena, whether it's a cloud or a field or man-made objects, they seem to emerge from something more fundamental, like waves on the ocean. So to me, that's an experience of oneness. I feel as though I'm touching into the fundamental oneness of the universe. So, my perspective is based on those experiences.
Being connected to everything, in other words. That sort of feeling.
Yeah. An experience of oneness, of the oneness of everything, and also my own connection to the oneness, my own participation in the oneness. Okay. I've also had psi experiences too, so it's partly based.
Oh, right.
I've always been open-minded about psi because I've had psi experiences myself.
But did you ever visit a medium, for example, who convinced you that is something like this? No.
Never a medium. No. But just kind of unexpected psi experiences, like precognitive dreams, that kind of thing.
Okay. If you would have to explain the gist of your book to somebody who isn't very much aware of things spiritual, how would you do that in a nutshell?
I would say that there are so many problems with the standard materialistic view of reality. Materialism as a paradigm, as an explanation of reality, just doesn't work. There are so many holes and gaps and problems in materialist explanations. That applies to consciousness. It applies to, the effect of the mind on the body. Mm-hmm. And for example, in the placebo effect, or in hypnosis, when the mind can have an amazingly strong effect on the body. And there are problems with things like altruism. It's very difficult to explain altruism in materialist terms. And there are also a lot of phenomena which materialists have to just deny or disregard because you just can't explain them. They don't make any sense in materialist terms, like near-death experiences, psi phenomena, spirit experiences, and so on. So, as an explanation for reality, materialism just doesn't work. So you have to look for an alternative paradigm, a different view of reality. So my alternative paradigm is that consciousness is a fundamental force, a fundamental quality in the universe, which pervades everything and which gives rise to all material things. So once you assume that consciousness is a fundamental quality, then you can use that as the basis for explaining nature and human experience. And it works in a much better way than materialism.
And you would be able, or you can explain things like, for example, NDEs and clairvoyance and so forth, isn't it? If you start from that concept of consciousness not being produced by the brain, but consciousness, the primacy of consciousness, in other words. You've written the book 2 years ago, is that correct?
It was published about 18 months ago.
18 months ago. Is there anything you would write differently today, after 18 months?
Not really. No, I don't think so. No, the book, even though I wrote it quite quickly, but it was building up for a long time inside me. And it was a book that I felt I was always going to write at some point.
It still stands, in other words.
I think so. Yeah, there's nothing I would like to change. Mm-hmm. No.
Was there anything, any of your research with regards to that book that surprised you? Did anything of your findings in your research surprise you as such?
One thing that surprised me, when I wrote my chapter on Psi, I did some research into skeptics and their attitude to psi phenomena. And I found out about a number of studies which had positive results, studies of psi phenomena which had positive results, where the researchers were obviously skeptics, and they went to some quite sort of they went to lengths to disregard or explain away the positive results in quite an underhand way, in quite a disreputable way.
Sometimes aggressive way, I would say.
Yeah, like Richard Wiseman, he's an example, for example. He sets up experiments which are basically doomed to failure. But occasionally, there may be positive results which he explains away. There was another set of researchers. They did 9 separate experiments on precognition, and every one of them had positive results. But because they were skeptics, they were very depressed about these positive results. So they devised a 10th experiment, which produced negative results. And according to their study, the 10th set of negative results meant that the previous 9 sets of positive results were no longer valid. So the 10th experiment disproved all the 9 previous experiments. So I was surprised that scientists some scientists have such a dogmatic view that they refuse to accept
closed mind.
Yeah, they refuse to accept valid evidence and they explain it away in such a disreputable way.
Related to that, how would you explain the enormous presence of so much literature and films and videos and things on things such as NDEs and other psychic phenomena and so on, and the fact that so many scientists seem to ignore all of this? How would you explain that?
I think there is a lot of discontent with the materialist paradigm, especially in secular cultures such as Western Europe. And also, the secular aspects of American culture. People, they are brought up with a materialist perspective, but they sense intuitively that there is more. They sense intuitively that it's not it's not a successful or valid explanation of reality. So they're always looking for alternative aspects of human experience to focus on. And I think people intuitively know, a lot of people have had psi experiences. Research shows that, although a lot of scientists do not accept psi experiences, most people actually do believe in psi phenomena, partly because they've had experiences themselves. I read some recent research which showed that I think it was about 30% of people have had a precognitive experience. A similar number of people have had a telepathic experience and so on. So if you add all the numbers together, different types of psi experiences, quite a significant proportion of the population have had these experiences. So obviously, they believe in these phenomena, even though scientists and academics may tell them that they're not true.
We interviewed a lot of people over here on the street, asking them if they believed in a soul, if they thought they had a soul. And not surprisingly, more than 85% of them said yes. We think we have, even not religious people, but they all thought, they all were convinced that they had a soul. That was also quite an eye-opener for me too.
Yeah, surveys show that most people who are not religious do believe in some kind of afterlife.
They do. I'm looking at the clock because I know we have to finish at 45. You've got another appointment.
I've got to
another
about
appointment.
10 to, about 50, 14, 50.
No, we'd almost finished. I made sure that the questions would be. Is there a new book in the making?
Yes, actually. I was writing my new book this morning. I've done a lot of research as a psychologist on transformational experiences. I sometimes call them awakening experiences. I sometimes call it post-traumatic transformation because usually it happens in the context of intense psychological turmoil and suffering. So I've gathered together my research and I'm going to present it as a book. So I've done research on transformational experiences in prisoners, for example. And it's surprising how common it is for prisoners to undergo a spiritual awakening, a shift in perspective and a shift in identity.
Because of also, being locked up or
Well, I think it comes from two things. It comes from being locked up and spending a lot of time in quietness, in inactivity. You're forced to confront yourself and explore yourself. But I think it also comes from a loss of identity. When you are in prison, you lose your normal sense of identity, you lose your normal context and your normal roles and so on. So often when people lose their sense of identity, they undergo a shift. They undergo a spiritual awakening. So also I've interviewed people who have had that kind of experience after bereavement. Also people who've had that experience through addiction, through years of being addicted to hard drugs and so on. So yeah, I've collected a lot of very interesting case studies. So I'm writing about these case studies.
I'm thinking of Eckhart Tolle now. He was also in a lot of a turmoil at the time.
Yeah,
in his 30s, early 30s.
That's right. Often when people are completely broken down, when their lives are so full of turmoil that they feel as though they've hit rock bottom, then they undergo this transformation. Another example is soldiers. I've interviewed a couple of soldiers who've had transformational experiences when they were in combat, when they were facing death. So often it could be, an encounter with death through a suicide attempt or an intention to commit suicide, Or it could be an NDE, encounter with death through an NDE. But any situation where people lose everything and they lose their sense of identity, that's there's a strong possibility that they may undergo a shift in identity. They may undergo a spiritual transformation.